In the spring of 1500, a man of 48 years walked back into Florence after almost 20 years away, carrying in his leather bags notebooks that already held more curious ideas than most libraries in the whole of Christendom. His name was Leonardo, son of Piero, from the town of Vinci, and he came back almost like someone running from another life. Milan had fallen. French troops had marched into the city in the autumn of 1499, and Duke Ludovico Sforza, the man who had kept him in his service for nearly 18 years, had lost his throne. The bronze meant for the greatest horse statue in Europe had been melted down for cannons. The painter, engineer, and thinker who had grown famous under the Sforza name now returned to his home city with no steady patron, no workshop of his own, not even a fixed place to live. Florence in 1500 was an uneasy republic. The Medici family had been driven out 6 years before. Girolamo Savonarola had been burned in the Piazza della Signoria in 1498. And although Piero Soderini would not be named leader for life until 1502, the city was already run by a shaky council trying to hold things together. A long and costly war against Pisa dragged on to the west. Pisa had broken free of Florentine rule in 1495 and was still openly independent. To the south, the growing power of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, was starting to loom over all of central Italy. And yet Florence still carried the spirit left by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and the workshop of Verrocchio, where Leonardo himself had trained as a boy. Into this tense, brilliant city he walked once more, older now, sharper, and already known by name. His first shelter was the convent of Santissima Annunziata, on the northeastern edge of the city, where the Servite friars gave him rooms and food in exchange for the promise of a painting. According to Giorgio Vasari, the space they gave him held not just the master himself, but his whole household, the young assistant from Milan known as Salaì, who had been with him since 1490, older apprentices, and a few servants besides. In a household like this, the day started before sunrise. Bells from the churches nearby marked the hours, and the assistants got up in the dim light to open the shutters, sweep the floor, and lay out the workshop tools. Apprentices ground pigments on slabs of hard stone, often porphyry or marble, using a cone-shaped grinding stone, working the powder into linseed oil until it was fine enough for the master's glazes. The most expensive pigment, ultramarine, came from lapis lazuli, mined far away in the mountains of the Levant, in land that today lies in Afghanistan. It was worth more than gold by weight and was measured out grain by grain. Lead white was mixed for the grounds. Ochres and umbers were washed and refined. Vermilion was rinsed with care. Malachite and verdigris were kept apart from the other colors so they would not spoil them. And the resins meant to give the finished paint its glow were softened over a low flame. Ground bone, egg white, and walnut oil sat ready in small clay pots, and brushes made of squirrel or hog bristle, tied to wooden handles with waxed thread, were checked one by one for loose hairs. Light was the workshop's first material. Tall windows on the north side let in a steady, cool daylight, so the moving sun would not throw shadows across a wet panel. On oak tables stood the poplar boards that would become paintings, aged wood, sanded until smooth, coated with a thick, bright layer of lead white as a base. It was this pale ground beneath that gave the finished paintings their inner glow, because on top of it, the master built his image not with brush strokes, but with thin veils of color. Dozens of see-through layers, each thinner than a hair, each left to dry before the next went on. Modern studies of his panels have found layers only a few micrometers thick, and experts believe as many as 30 separate films of paint make up the softest passages of skin. He worked slowly, laying one glaze, waiting days for it to dry, checking it against the light from the window before choosing the next shade. Between sessions, the apprentices covered the panels with linen to keep off the dust, and the workshop settled into a long, patient quiet. Salaì, by then a young man in his early 20s, moved between running errands and tending the canvases, carrying letters, buying supplies from the merchants at the Mercato Vecchio, and, by the master's own account, now and then wearing out the household's patience with his mischief and his fondness for fine clothes bought on borrowed money. This was the method later generations would call sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke, a way of painting where outlines melt away and light seems to rise up from the surface itself. In these years in Florence, Leonardo used it most of all on the great full-sized drawing of the Virgin, the Infant Christ, and Saint Anne, sketched on paper large enough to cover a wall. Vasari wrote that the drawing pulled in crowds of men and women, young and old, who came to see it as though attending a feast day. From that same careful arrangement of interlocking figures, the puzzling smile, the soft blending of light, grew the portrait, begun around 1503, of Lisa Gherardini, wife of the silk merchant Francesco del Giocondo. The panel that later ages would call the Mona Lisa was born on a plank of poplar wood in a Florentine workshop, and Leonardo would keep it with him, never quite finished, endlessly reworked, for the rest of his life. Not every morning went to the easel. Leonardo believed a painter's true teacher was the world itself, and much of his time in Florence went into walking. He would cross the market that filled the Piazza della Signoria at first light, where the faces of sellers, porters, clerks, and farmers gave him the whole range of human expression to study. He watched swifts circle above the rooftops and swoop low over the Arno at dusk, and he wrote about their wings as though studying a machine. He stood at the rails of the Ponte Vecchio watching the swirls that formed behind the stone piers, or where an oar cutting the water left its mark, and later filled his notebooks with drawings of water curling in on itself, comparing its spirals to the curls in a woman's hair. Water and air, he wrote, followed the same rules. A bird in flight and a river in motion were, in his eyes, two versions of the same thing. He wrote these pages in a script that ran backward, from right to left, the letters mirrored, a habit he had carried since youth, whether by choice or simply because it suited his left hand. And it worked, too, as a kind of private code. Most of what he produced in this Florentine period would later be gathered into what is now known as the Codex Atlanticus, a collection of 12 volumes kept at the Ambrosian Library in Milan. Its pages, covering his whole working life, hold studies of fortresses, war machines, water systems, human figures, fables, and, from around 1503 to 1504, sketches of horses meant for a battle scene, along with a hail of shells fired from mortars into a fortified town. By early afternoon, once the light in the workshop had grown too harsh, the master often went out again, this time toward the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, one of Florence's great charitable institutions. There, in a quiet room set apart for the purpose, he was allowed to dissect bodies made available to him by the hospital. He worked slowly, opening the body layer by layer, drawing the muscles as he uncovered them, tracing the pale cords of tendons across the joints, following the blood vessels down into the chambers of the heart. It was in that hospital, at some point in this period, that he examined the body of an old man he had spoken with shortly before his death, a case he described in his notes as a study of the vessels that carry life away. Across his lifetime, he would dissect around 30 human bodies and produce anatomical drawings that scholars today consider centuries ahead of their time. Then, in the summer of 1502, another door opened. Cesare Borgia, working to secure his conquests in the Romagna, offered Leonardo the position of architect and chief engineer. For about 10 months, the master traveled among the fortresses of central Italy, mapping walls, measuring towers, suggesting improvements. Out of this work came the well-known bird's-eye map of Imola, drawn with such precise geometry that scholars still count it among the earliest scientifically accurate city maps in Europe. In the notebooks from this year in the Romagna also appears the name of Niccolò Machiavelli, the young Florentine official, and the two men would soon work together again on the boldest engineering scheme of the decade. When Leonardo came back to Florence, the Republic pulled him into its long struggle with Pisa. Between 1503 and 1504, together with Machiavelli, he studied whether the Arno River itself could be diverted, cut into a new channel that would leave Pisa dry, cut off from its river, its trade, and its route to the sea. Plans were drawn up, digging began, and thousands of laborers were gathered on the plain below the city. A sudden flood wrecked much of the earthworks, and the plan was dropped. Still, the drawings of curving channels, dams, and sluice gates remained, and they would shape the master's later writings on water for years to come. The same years brought a public rivalry that all of Florence savored. In 1501, the young Michelangelo Buonarroti had begun carving a huge figure from a block of marble long left unused in the cathedral yard. When the David was unveiled in the Piazza della Signoria on the 8th of September 1504, it stood only a short walk from the workshops where Leonardo worked. Soon after, both men were hired to paint battle scenes on facing walls of the great council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo chose as his subject the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory from the century before, and began working on the composition from October of 1503 onward. Instead of the usual fresco method, which called for fast painting onto wet plaster, he tried an experimental technique using oil and wax-bound paints applied to a specially prepared wall. It is generally said that when he tried to speed up the drying with heat, the upper layers of paint melted or slid down, and the work was left unfinished. The composition survives only through preparatory drawings and copies made by other artists, since the wall itself was later covered over by Giorgio Vasari's own frescoes. Whether any trace of the original still lies underneath is a question modern research has looked into again without a final answer. Through all these years, the workshop at Santissima Annunziata and later other rented rooms across the city stayed a small, orderly world. In early mornings, the apprentices ground pigments and prepared the panels. Toward late morning, the master painted, sometimes for hours without a word, sometimes for only a few minutes before stepping back to study a single face for the rest of the day. Meals were simple, eaten together with the Servite friars in the refectory, mostly bread, vegetable soups, cheese, and wine cut with water. The moment sunlight faded, the master turned to his journals. By the glow of an oil lamp, he'd jot the day's findings: a stranger's face spotted in the marketplace, a bird's wing, a math ratio, notes on a heart valve, or a concept for a water-lifting device, all penned in that backward-flowing script, often paired with a quick sketch alongside. These pages from that period reveal a mind that shifted effortlessly among anatomy, hydraulics, optics, geology, and painting, treating them not as separate fields, but as connected sections of one continuous study of nature. As for his own eating habits, his written records and testimonies from later years suggest he leaned toward plants and beans over meat. His household ledgers, written in a tight, economical hand, list purchases of chickpeas, leafy greens, fruit, and now and then a jug of wine. Meanwhile, Florence carried on with its usual bustling rhythm. Church bells sounded over the terracotta rooftops, processions moved along the bridges, and envoys traveled to and from the Palazzo Vecchio.
Word arrived in pieces. Borgia's downfall following his father's death in 1503, wins and losses for the French forces to the north, and outbreaks of plague that would empty streets from time to time. At the Arte della Lana warehouses, wool traders unloaded their shipments. Moneylenders from the Arte del Cambio tallied florins across green tablecloths. Boats loaded with grain and stone floated down the Arno, passing beneath the Ponte alla Carraia. Under Soderini's leadership, the Republic went about its routine affairs, commissioning paintings, sculptures, defensive structures, and diplomatic trips, mostly unaware that the pair of artists working in its main square were shaping an entirely new standard for human achievement. By 1508, things had changed. Leonardo took on work from the French government in Milan, then under Charles of Amboise, and the chance at steady patronage pulled him back north. He departed Florence along with his household, his journals, and the unfinished painting of the silk merchant's wife, passing through the very same gates he'd entered through 8 years earlier. Behind him, the workshops shut their doors, the poplar wood panels were crated up, and the porphyry stones and grinding tools were wrapped away. What stayed behind in Florence was quieter, yet it endured. Within the surviving notebooks, the Codex Atlanticus, the anatomical drawings later housed at Windsor, and the small notebooks that eventually spread across Europe, a distinctive way of observing the world had been preserved. His cartoons and painted panels had introduced a fresh approach to depicting the human face, where shadow served not as an edge, but as a transition.
And lingering in the city's memory, the aging master strolling home from Santa Maria Nuova as evening fell, apprentices grinding blue pigment on porphyry stone, swifts circling above the Arno just as he laid down his brush. That lasting image would continue to shape how the world pictured the Renaissance, long after the workshop lamps had been extinguished.